There is a moment, and every man who has ever stood close enough to death to smell its breath knows exactly the moment I mean, when the world goes absolutely, terrifyingly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of a Sunday morning or a still pond at dawn, the other kind. The kind where sound doesn't disappear so much as it gets swallowed whole, pulled under by something heavier than silence. The kind where you can hear your own pulse in your teeth. I've kept a logbook for 23 years. Filled 41 of them, cover to cover, in handwriting that started neat and got worse every decade, the way a man's certainties do. I've written down cattle counts and weather patterns and the names of men I've buried. I've recorded droughts and floods, and one memorable occasion when a traveling preacher's wagon caught fire during his own sermon about hellfire, which I noted down because the irony seemed too important to lose. But I never, not once in 41 logbooks, thought I'd be writing down what I saw the morning Cass Harlan stood on a gallows platform in the town of Redrock, New Mexico territory, with a rope around his neck and 300 people watching him die. And I never thought I'd be writing down what his horse did next. I want to be careful here because I've seen men sensationalize things. I've seen campfire stories grow legs and run so far from the truth that the truth itself wouldn't recognize them in the street. What I'm about to tell you is not a campfire story. I wrote it down in logbook 42, entry 1, on the morning it happened, with sawdust from the gallows platform still on my boots and my hands shaking badly enough that some of the letters came out wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened. Every word of it. And before we're through, you're going to have to decide for yourself what it means. Because I've been turning it over in my head for 4 years now, and I still can't tell you whether what saved Cass Harlan that morning was luck, or instinct, or something older and stranger than either of those words can hold. What I can tell you is this. A man walked up those gallows steps guilty of nothing but the wrong last name and a horse that loved him more than he loved himself. Start with the horse. I need to tell you about the rope first, because the rope is where everything begins. It was hemp, coarse-braided, the kind that leaves a burn just from touching it. The hangman, a compact, gray-fingered man from Santa Fe named Elmore Pitch, had soaked it in water the night before to give it weight, the way they do, so it would drop clean and fast when the platform gave. I know this because I watched him do it. I was staying in the hotel directly across the yard from the jail, and my window faced the wrong direction for sleep and the right direction for witnessing things I wasn't supposed to witness. I watched Elmore Pitch hang that rope over the crossbeam of the gallows in the blue hour before dawn, and I watched him test the knot 3 times, and I watched him wipe his hands on his trousers afterward, not from dirt, I think, but from something else. Some residue a man picks up when he handles the instrument of another man's ending. I wrote it down. Elmore Pitch, hangman, wipes his hands after touching the rope, doesn't look at it when he walks away. The town of Redrock in October of 1887 was the kind of place that had a strong opinion about itself, and the evidence to back it up on most days. It sat at the junction of 2 cattle routes in the eastern shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and it had a bank, 3 saloons, a general store, a church, a telegraph office, and a jail that was newer and sturdier than the church, which told you something about the town's priorities. The sheriff was a man named Dale Holt, long-jawed, deliberate, the kind of man who thought twice before saying anything, and then usually said less than he'd thought. He had a reputation for being fair, which in the New Mexico territory in 1887 was the kind of reputation that either protected you or made you a target, depending on the day. I was in Redrock because of a cattle dispute between 2 ranches to the north, the kind of slow, grinding legal argument that required a surveyor and a notary and several weeks of riding back and forth over disputed fence lines, and I was the surveyor. I kept detailed logbooks because the work demanded precision, and because I was the kind of man who found comfort in the act of recording things. If something was written down, it had shape, it had edges. You could look at it from the outside. I did not know Cass Harlan when I arrived in Redrock on the 14th of October. By the morning of the 21st, I knew him well enough that watching them lead him up the gallows steps felt like something breaking inside my chest. A clean, dry snap, like a branch in cold weather. I'll tell you how I met him. It was my 3rd day in town. I'd finished my preliminary measurements on the northern fence line and come back to Redrock for supplies, and for the particular luxury of a meal I hadn't cooked myself over a fire. I was eating at the hotel dining room, gray beans, cornbread, coffee so thick you could stand a spoon in it, and making notes in my logbook about the fence line's eastern deviation, which was the crux of the whole dispute and had been giving me a headache for 2 days. The commotion started outside. Not loud exactly, but the kind of noise that has intention in it, voices with a direction, footsteps with a purpose. I have a weakness for commotion. My wife called it nosiness. I preferred to think of it as professional thoroughness, since a surveyor who doesn't pay attention to his surroundings makes errors. I set down my fork and went to the window. They were bringing someone in. 4 men on horseback, 2 on either side, and between them a man walking, not riding, walking with his wrists bound in front of him, and a lead rope from his bound hands to one of the rider's saddle horns. Behind this group, following at a distance that suggested both loyalty and the intelligence to know when loyalty has limits, came a horse. Not led, not tied, just following. The horse was a grulla. If you don't know horses, grulla is that particular gray-blue color that looks like smoke on cold mornings, like something between existing and not. A color that has no clear name in most languages, because most languages weren't made by people who spent enough time looking at horses in low light. This one was lean and tall with a white star on its forehead, and a long, uneven scar along its left shoulder that had grown back a lighter gray than the surrounding coat, so it caught the light differently. The horse walked with its head lowered, ears half flat, watching the man being led ahead of it. Not watching the riders, watching the man. I wrote it down. Grulla horse following prisoner, eyes on the man. The prisoner was, and I want to be careful how I say this because I'm not given to romanticizing, unremarkable in the plainest possible sense. Medium height, work-worn clothes, the kind that have been washed so many times they've lost whatever color they started with and settled into a universal brown. Brown canvas trousers, brown canvas coat, brown boots with the left heel worn lower than the right, which tells you about a man's stride. He was maybe 28, 29. Dark hair, a week's worth of beard, a cut above his left eyebrow that had been cleaned but not particularly well. He wasn't struggling. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the resigned stillness of a man who's given up, but something more careful than that, a deliberate, measured calm that suggested he was paying close attention to everything around him and choosing very specifically not to react to any of it. His eyes moved, scanning the street, the storefronts, the people stopping to stare, not in panic, in assessment. I came out onto the boardwalk without quite deciding to. "What'd he do?" I asked the man standing next to me, a leather goods merchant whose name I never learned. Harlan, the merchant said, like the name itself was the answer. "I don't know that name." The merchant looked at me the way people in small towns look at outsiders who have revealed an embarrassing ignorance. Red Harlan's brother, Cattle Harlan. The ones that have been running raids out of the Cimarron for 2 seasons. I said I'd heard of the Harlan raids. Everyone within 3 territories had, but I hadn't known there was a brother. Cassidy Harlan, Cass, younger one. They say he's the one who planned the raids on the Henderson spreads, burned 2 line camps, ran off 140 head. They caught him last night east of Pedra Creek, coming back from across the border. Alone. I looked at the prisoner, at Cass Harlan, being led toward the jail. The grulla horse was still following, still watching the man, still carrying its head low. One of the riders had noticed the horse and made a half-hearted attempt to shoo it away, and the horse had simply moved to the other side of the street and kept walking. Following. "What about the horse?" I said. The merchant shrugged. "Just goes wherever he goes, I guess." I should tell you why I'm telling you this, since a surveyor from Albuquerque watching a prisoner being brought in is hardly a story. I'm telling you because I did something that day that I still can't entirely explain to my own satisfaction. I went to the jail. Not immediately. I finished my beans, paid for my meal, spent another hour on the fence line notes. But the image of the grulla horse following that man through the street had lodged itself somewhere behind my eyes and wouldn't shift, and eventually I accepted that I was going to have to do something about it. So I walked to the jail on the pretense of asking Sheriff Holt about property boundaries in the disputed area, a transparently thin excuse that Sheriff Holt saw through immediately. "You're here about the Harlan boy," he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "I'm here about the property boundary records for section." "You're here about the Harlan boy," Holt said, and this time he did look up, and his long jaw carried that particular expression of a man who has watched too many people lie to him to be even slightly inconvenienced by one more lie. It's fine. Half the town's been through here today for one reason or another. Come on. He took me back to the cell. Cass Harlan was sitting on the cot with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, not in the posture of a man waiting to be executed, but in the posture of a man doing arithmetic in his head, working through a problem. His hands, freed of the ropes, were folded loosely together, and his eyes were on the middle distance, that unfocused gaze of hard internal concentration. He looked up when we came in. His eyes were a dark hazel, the kind that red, brown, or green depending on the light, and they moved from Holt to me with the same measured assessment I'd seen on the street. "Who's this?" he said. "Nobody," Holt said, which was accurate enough. "Surveyors aren't nobody," Harlan said, looking at the caliper I'd absent-mindedly tucked into my breast pocket that morning. The way he'd spotted it so quickly, the small, habitual detail, the piece of professional equipment I'd stopped even noticing I carried, told me something about how he moved through the world. Paying attention. Always paying attention. "Cassidy Harlan," I said. "My name is Thomas Bream." "Mr. Bream?" He said it with courtesy, the kind of courtesy that's been learned rather than born into, practiced until it sits naturally on top of whatever rougher material is underneath. "What do you survey?" "Fence lines mostly, land disputes." "Good work to be in around here." There was a window in the cell, small, barred, high up on the east wall. Through it came the sound of hammering, slow, rhythmic, unhurried hammering. The kind a man does when he has all the time in the world and knows exactly what he's building. Harlan's eyes went to the window, just for a moment, then back to me. "They started it this morning," he said. I didn't say anything. I didn't do what they say. He said it without force, without the desperate insistence of a man trying to convince himself. He said it the way a man states a compass direction. "I know how it sounds. Every man in every jail cell says that, but I need you to understand that I know the difference between what I did and what they're saying I did, and they are not the same thing." "What did you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. The hammering continued outside. "My brother did those raids," he said. "Red and 3 others. I knew about it. I tried to stop it. I went out to the Cimarron camp twice to argue Red out of it, and twice he didn't listen, which is the history of Red and me going back 30 years. When they came to arrest him, he was gone. When they came for me, I was still there, because I live within 40 miles of where the raids happened, and I have the same name." "That's not a crime," I said. "The Henderson spread lost 140 head and 2 line camps," Harlan said. "Somebody has to hang for that. Red's not available. I'm the next Harlan in line." He said it without self-pity. That was what made it unbearable to hear. Not the content of what he was saying, but the complete absence of any expectation of sympathy, as though self-pity was a luxury so remote from his experience that he'd simply never developed the habit. "Who's your attorney?" I said. "Had one. Judge Traber ruled the evidence sufficient for capital proceedings before my attorney even got here from Raton. He's still on his way, I think. Trial was 2 days ago." 2 days? "Trial, sentencing, and execution all within the week," Holt said from behind me, and his voice had something in it I couldn't name. Not quite guilt, something adjacent to it. "Judge Traber has a circuit to keep." I looked at Holt. Holt looked at the wall. "Is there anything?" I started. "There's nothing," Harlan said, and he said it gently, the way you tell a child there's no more of something without anger. "I've thought through every angle. There's nothing. I just wanted somebody to write down that I was here, and I said it plain and clear. I didn't do it." I looked at him. "Write it down," he said. "You keep a logbook. I can see it in your pocket." I took out the logbook. I uncapped my pen. And in the margin beside my fence line measurements in the jail in Redrock on the 17th of October, 1887, I wrote, "Cassidy Harlan. States plainly he did not do it." He watched me write it, and then he nodded once and looked back at the high window. Outside, the hammering continued. "I want to tell you about the horse, because you can't understand any of what comes later without understanding the horse first. Its name was Dust. Cass had named it himself 6 years prior when it was a 2-year-old colt that had come to him through a complicated chain of trades involving a broken wagon wheel, a debt owed in Tucson, and 3 weeks of patient work in a corral outside Mora. He told me this on my second visit. I had no reason for a second visit beyond the same reason I'd had for the first, which was that I couldn't leave it alone. He wasn't rideable when I got him, Cass said. Previous owner had started him wrong, rough hands, no patience, the kind of method that teaches a horse that humans mean pain. Most horses train that way, they stay that way. They learn to associate hands with hurt, and they never fully unlearn it. But Dust did. Dust decided to. He said it without drama as a simple fact. I spent 3 weeks just being near him, not touching him, not asking anything of him, just near, eating my meals in the corral, reading when I had something to read, sleeping out there a few nights when the weather allowed. And one morning I woke up and he was standing over me with his head lowered, breathing on my face, and I understood that we had an agreement. What kind of agreement? Cass thought about this. The kind where you don't pretend to be something you're not, he said. Horses know, they always know. You can fool a man with your face, but you can't fool a horse. They read something deeper than faces. Through the jail window, faint but audible, came the sound of a horse, a single resonant call, not frantic, not frightened. Just present. I'm here, I'm out here. Cass's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight easing, as though the sound itself was a hand on his shoulder. Is that Dust? I asked, though I already knew. Been out there since they brought me in, Cass said. They tried to run him off twice. He went around the block and came back. Does he do that often? Stay close like that? When he thinks I need it, Cass said. I wrote that down, too, and felt slightly embarrassed about how much it moved me. On the 4th day, I did something reckless. I telegraphed the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe. Not because I had any official standing to do so. I didn't. I was a surveyor with a fence-line dispute and a personal logbook and a deep discomfort with injustice. But because the logbook entry I'd written on the 17th was burning a hole in my conscience, and I couldn't think of anything else to do. I sent my own name and credentials, explained the timeline of the proceedings, the 2-day period between arrest and execution, the attorney who hadn't arrived, and asked whether the territorial statutes required a minimum period for legal representation to be in place before capital sentence could be carried out. I did not expect a reply. I sent it anyway because writing something down, even in a telegraph, gives it shape, gives it edges, makes it real in a way that just thinking it doesn't. The reply came on the 5th day. I won't reproduce the telegraph here except to say that it was brief, and that it said, essentially, that the minimum prescribed period under territorial statute was 7 days from arrest to execution in capital cases, and that the governor's office would be, the word they used was interested, in reviewing any case that appeared to have proceeded outside that window. I stood in the telegraph office for a long time after reading it. Then I walked to the jail, and I told Holt, and I watched his long jaw go through 3 or 4 distinct expressions before settling on something that looked like relief pretending to be skepticism. That's not enough, he said. The governor's office being interested isn't a stay, it's not a writ, it's not anything I can take to Traber. I know, I said, but it's something. Traber's leaving the territory the day after the execution. He's not going to. I know, I said again, but I'm going to send another telegraph, and another after that, and I'm going to keep the record of every one of them. Holt looked at me. He was quiet for a while. Then, why are you doing this? I thought about Cass Harlan sitting on his cot doing arithmetic. I thought about Dust standing outside the jail all night calling once every few hours, I'm here. I'm out here. I'm a surveyor, I said. I measure things so people can't argue about where the lines are later. I'm measuring this. Holt was quiet again. Then he said quietly, the execution's the 21st. That's 7 days from arrest. I counted backward. The arrest had been the 14th. 7 days was the 21st. The execution was the 21st. They cut it to the exact minimum, I said. Or exactly to it, Holt said, depending on how you read the statute. I went back to the telegraph office. On the 6th day, I told Cass about the telegraphs. He listened. He didn't change his expression much, which I'd come to understand was not indifference but a kind of disciplined hope management. He'd learned, somewhere along the way, that hope is expensive, and he wasn't going to spend it until he knew what he was getting for the price. The attorney from Raton, he said when I finished, is he still coming? Last I heard. What's last you heard? 4 days ago. He nodded slowly. Could be anything, road conditions, could be he changed his mind, could be someone discouraged him. Or he's just delayed. Yes, Cass said, could be that. He was quiet for a while. Through the window came the sound of a slight wind, and beneath it, the slow movement of a horse walking back and forth. Dust pacing outside. Can I ask you something personal? Cass said. You can ask. Why do you keep the logbook? I thought about it. So things don't disappear, I said. Events, people, conversations, things disappear if nobody writes them down. They happen, but they leave no mark, and in a generation nobody knows they happened, and in 2 generations it's as if they didn't. Writing things down it's like surveying. It establishes that something was here. Cass looked at me for a long moment with those dark hazel eyes. My mother's name was Eliza, he said. She died when Red and I were young. She used to say that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he took, but by what he gave, and that most men go their whole lives never figuring that out. He paused. She was right about most men. She might have been wrong about Red. Was she right about you? He looked at the window. Dust called from outside, that low, resonant sound, present and deliberate. I was working toward it, Cass said. I wrote that down, working toward it. The night before the execution, I did not sleep. I sat at my window and watched the jail and listened to the sounds of the town settling into itself for the night. The saloons closing, the horses at the hitching posts, the distant bark of a dog, the slow creak of the hotel sign in the wind. One by one, the lights in the windows across the street went out. Dust was visible from my window if I leaned slightly to the right. He'd found a position at the corner of the alley beside the jail where the night marshal had apparently decided he wasn't worth the effort of moving, and he stood there in the dark like a weather vane, his gray-blue coat almost invisible except for the white star on his forehead, which caught the faint lamplight from the street. He wasn't making noise now, just standing. I wrote in my logbook for a while, the summary of the telegraphs, the timeline, every detail I could fit. Then I stopped writing and just watched Dust standing there in the dark, and I thought about what Cass had said. They read something deeper than faces. I'm not given to mysticism. I'm a surveyor. I deal in measurable distances and verifiable angles and the precise documentation of observable fact. But there was something about that horse standing alone in the dark, outside a jail where the man who'd raised him was waiting to be hanged, some quality of intention in the stillness of it. That made the measurable and verifiable feel suddenly very small. I fell asleep in the chair sometime before dawn, and I dreamed about fence lines that moved. They came for Cass at 8 in the morning. The town had turned out. Not with celebration, this wasn't that kind of crowd. More the grim, obligatory gathering of a community doing what communities do when the law demands an audience, uncomfortable with the whole business but unwilling to be the one who looked away. 300 people, give or take, in a loose crescent around the Gallows platform in the center of Main Street. Elmore Pitch was already on the platform with his gray fingers and his soaked rope. I was in the crowd toward the front because I couldn't have stayed away if I'd tried, and because I had 42 pages of logbook notes that felt, increasingly, like the only record that the truth of this had existed at all. Sheriff Holt walked beside Cass, not pulling, not pushing, just walking at his shoulder, which I think was the only gesture of decency Holt had left to offer. Cass walked with the same measured calm he'd had since the first moment I'd seen him. Head level, eyes moving, not closed off, open, watching, still in that mode of perpetual careful assessment, as though even now he was looking for angles, calculating distances. Behind them, at the edge of the crowd, Dust appeared. I don't know where he'd come from, out of the alley, presumably, trailing them through the street. But there he was at the back of the gathered crowd, gray-blue and tall, his head up now, ears forward, watching the Gallows platform with an intensity that made several of the townspeople nearest him step sideways without quite knowing why. Cass didn't look back. Maybe he knew. Maybe he could feel it. Holt read the charges. Cass stood with his hands now rebound at the small of his back, and listened to the charges being read about the raids and the cattle and the burned line camps, and his face said nothing about any of it. Judge Traber, a narrow-faced man with the general demeanor of someone who had been slightly annoyed with the world for 40 years, and had made his peace with being annoyed, offered Cass the traditional opportunity to make a final statement. Cass Harlan looked out at 300 people. "I didn't do it," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it to me in the jail cell, clean, plain, without desperation. The statement of a compass direction. North is north. He didn't do it. A few people in the crowd shifted. A few looked at each other. Elmore Pitch stepped forward and began placing the noose. And that is when the thing happened that I have spent 4 years trying to find words adequate to describe. Dust screamed, not the startled cry of a frightened horse, not the whinny of an animal caught by surprise, something else, something that seemed to come from a deeper part of the animal than ordinary sound reaches, a voice that carried every note at once, fury and grief, and something that, if a horse can be said to have it, was very close to outrage. It split the morning air like something breaking. 300 people turned. Dust was moving. Not panicked movement, not the wild bolt of a scared animal. He was moving with purpose, shouldering through the crowd at the back, which parted for him with more alacrity than it had parted for anything else that morning, because there is something in that kind of movement that every animal instinct recognizes. He came through the crowd like water through a gap, head down and driving, and he hit the front of the gathered townspeople and kept going, toward the gallows, toward the platform, toward Cass. The noose was on, not yet tightened. Elmore Pitch had it loosely at Cass's neck and was reaching for the knot. Dust reached the base of the gallows steps. What happened in the next 30 seconds I have reconstructed from my own observation, and from 6 other witnesses I interviewed afterward, because the human brain, confronted with the genuinely unexpected, has a way of fragmenting its recording, of losing the fluid sequence of events in the effort to make sense of each individual piece. Dust put his front hooves on the first gallows step. He had never, Cass told me this afterward, he had never been trained for anything like that. There was no trick here, no performed routine, no memory of a command to climb stairs. He simply put his front hooves on the step and his weight forward and he went up. Gallows steps are not built for a horse. They're built for one man walking, and the platform at the top is barely wide enough for 2. What Dust did on those steps is something I cannot explain with any confidence except that he did it, and the entire structure of the gallows shook with the impact of him, and the crossbeam vibrated and the rope swayed, and Elmore Pitch stumbled backward and grabbed the beam to stay upright, and the knot at Cass's neck, the knot that hadn't been fully tightened yet, came loose. Not off, but loose, and Cass moved his head. And it was enough. The noose slipped from the configuration Pitch had built for it, and Cass ducked under it before Pitch recovered his footing. And by the time Pitch had his balance again, Cass's bound hands were at Dust's neck, awkward, graceless, but holding, and Dust was already coming back down the steps, backing down them with a sureness that made even less physical sense than going up. The crowd had become a single, collective held breath. Sheriff Holt had not moved. I looked at him. His hand was on his gun. It stayed there. He did not draw it. Dust hit the ground and turned and stood, and Cass stood pressed against him with his bound hands clutching the horse's mane, and the 2 of them were absolutely still in the center of the parted crowd. And for a moment that lasted much longer than any moment should nothing moved and nothing was said. Then Holt took his hand off his gun. He walked forward through the space the crowd had made. He looked at Cass. He looked at Dust. He looked at Elmore Pitch, who was standing on the gallows platform with an expression like a man who has just been personally insulted by the laws of nature. And then Holt looked back at the crowd and he said, "The proceeding is suspended." Suspended is a diplomatic word. What it meant in practical terms was that 300 people had watched a horse climb a gallows and pull a man off a noose, and that Sheriff Dale Holt, who had grown up in this territory, who had ridden with 3 different posses, who had buried men on both sides of the law, was standing in the middle of Main Street looking at a grulla horse with a white star on its forehead, and trying to figure out what law school had prepared him for this moment. The answer, I could have told him, was none of them. I was still in the crowd. I'd stopped writing in my logbook somewhere around the point when Dust started up the gallows steps, because there are some moments where the act of documentation and the act of witnessing are genuinely incompatible, and this was one of them. I had the pen in my hand and the logbook open and not a word on the page, just the impression of the pen tip where I'd rested it and forgotten to move it. After Holt said what he said, the crowd began to dissolve, not quickly, not with any particular decision, but the way crowds dissolve when the thing they came to see has been replaced by something nobody knows how to categorize. Small groups drifted toward the edges of the street. Conversations started in low voices. People looked at each other for confirmation that they'd seen what they'd seen. Two of Holt's deputies materialized from somewhere and took positions on either side of Cass, not touching him, not grabbing him, just present, which was enough. Cass wasn't going anywhere. He was still pressed against Dust's side, his bound hands buried in the horse's mane, and his eyes were closed. Just his eyes, everything else was upright and steady. I pushed through to where Holt was standing. "What does suspended mean?" I said. "It means I need to think," Holt said. "What is there to think about?" Holt looked at me with patient exhaustion. "Mr. Bream, I just suspended a legally sanctioned execution in front of 300 witnesses. There is a judge who signed that execution order. There is a sheriff's office that will ask for an accounting. There is a legal process that. There is a man who said plainly he didn't do it, and an attorney who hasn't arrived yet, and a territorial statute about minimum periods for legal representation," I said. "And there is a logbook with 42 pages of documentation." Holt was quiet. "The telegraphs," I said. "The governor's office said they were interested." "Interested isn't a stay." "No, but it's the beginning of a paper trail that leads to a review, which leads to questions about the timeline, which leads to questions about the trial that took 2 days, which leads to a judge who needs to account for his circuit schedule being more important to him than a man's life." Holt looked at the logbook in my hand. He looked at Cass, still against Dust's side, eyes still closed. "Go to the telegraph office," he said finally. "Send everything you have, names, dates, the statute reference, everything." "I will," I said, "but I need you to do something first." "What?" "Cut his hands loose." Holt looked at the deputies, at Cass, at the deputies again. Then he reached for his belt knife, walked to Cass, and cut the rope at his wrists. Cass opened his eyes. He looked at his hands for a moment, the red marks where the ropes had been. Then he put both hands flat on Dust's neck, and Dust turned his head and pressed his nose briefly, firmly, against Cass's collarbone. I've measured a lot of things in my life. Distances, angles, deviations, the precise boundaries where one man's land ends and another's begins. I've never found a unit of measurement adequate to what I saw in that small gesture. Horse's nose to man's collarbone. 6 inches, maybe. 6 inches that contained the whole of what had just happened, the whole of what Dust had known and done and offered. I turned away and walked to the telegraph office. The attorney from Raton arrived that afternoon. His name was Meredith Cook, young, dusty, visibly exhausted from a hard ride, with a canvas saddlebag full of documents and the look of a man who had received bad news along the road and was bracing himself for worse. He came directly to the jail, and I met him there, and for 2 hours the three of us, Cook, Holt, and I, sat in Holt's office and went through every piece of paper that existed about the Harlan case. There weren't many. That was, in its own way, evidence. 2 days, Cook said, looking at the trial record. He'd said it 3 times already in different tones. This time it was flat, affectless, the tone of a man setting down something heavy before picking it up again. From arraignment to sentencing in 2 days. Judge Traber had a circuit to keep, Holt said. Cook looked at him. Sheriff, the minimum statutory period. I know what the minimum period is, Holt said. Mr. Bream reminded me of it this morning. Cook looked at me. I'm a surveyor, I said. I was here for a fence line dispute. He's been very involved in this fence line dispute, Holt said, and there was something in his voice that might, under different circumstances, have been dry humor. Cook spread the papers on the desk and began organizing them with the focused, slightly trembling efficiency of someone who has found solid ground after a long fall and is moving very carefully on it. I watched him work and felt a complicated warmth. He was young, and he was frightened, and he was doing it anyway, which is the only version of courage that matters. I need to file for a review, Cook said. Based on the statute violation alone, there's grounds to set aside the sentence, if I can get a writ from the district court in Santa Fe. How long, Holt said. A week, maybe 10 days. Judge Traber leaves the territory. Judge Traber's schedule is not my concern right now, Cook said, with a firmness that surprised both Holt and me, I think. What's my concern is that a man was tried and sentenced to death in 2 days. His legal representation wasn't present, and the execution was, How exactly do I describe what happened this morning? Interrupted, I said. By a horse, Holt said. Cook looked at us both. By a horse. His horse, I said. There's a distinction. Cook made a sound that was either a laugh or a breath. It was hard to tell. He picked up his pen and began to write, and the scratch of it was the most reassuring sound I'd heard in days. I went back to Cass that evening. He was in the cell again. Holt had explained, with some delicacy, that he needed to remain in custody pending the review, since a man who'd had his execution interrupted by a horse was technically neither convicted nor exonerated, and the territory's legal framework had some opinions about where such a man ought to sleep. Cass had accepted this with the same equanimity he accepted everything. Cook got here, I told him. I know, Holt told me. He's filing for a review, based on the statute violation. Cass nodded. He was sitting in the same position as always, back against the wall, knees up, the internal arithmetic running behind his eyes. He looked different today, not relieved, not exactly, but like a man who has set down something very heavy and has not yet decided whether to pick it up again. Dust, he said, they haven't moved him. He's in the alley. Marshall stopped trying. A quiet exhale. He didn't eat this morning. I'm worried about him. This struck me so abruptly that I actually stopped for a moment. The man who had, 6 hours earlier, been standing on a gallows platform was worried about whether his horse had eaten. I couldn't decide whether this was admirable or heartbreaking. Both, probably. I'll bring him something, I said. There's a grain merchant on 2nd Street. He'll know what grulla horses need if you describe him. I know what horses need, I said, slightly stiffly. For the first time, Cass Harlan smiled. It was a small smile, sideways, the kind that's been careful for so long it doesn't know how to be large, but it reached his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Bream, he said. Thomas, I said, we're past Mr. Bream. He nodded, Thomas. I went to the grain merchant on 2nd Street and bought a feed bucket and came back and set it in the alley beside Dust, who regarded me with large, dark, measuring eyes, and then lowered his head and began to eat. I stood next to a grulla horse in an alley in Redrock, New Mexico territory, while he ate, and I took out my logbook and wrote until the light got too low to see the page. Here is something nobody tells you about waiting. It has texture, it has weight. It isn't just the absence of what you're waiting for, it has its own positive presence, its own specific gravity, and it presses on you differently at different hours of the day. Early morning waiting is brittle and bright and makes your hands unsteady. Midday waiting is heavy and airless. Evening waiting is gray and long and sits behind your eyes. For the next 6 days, Cass Harlan waited. And I watched him do it. I came every day, sometimes twice. I told myself it was because Cook needed witnesses who'd observed the proceedings, which was true. Cook interviewed me at length and included my logbook entries, with my permission, in the documentation he was compiling for the district court. But it was also because I couldn't stay away, and I'd stopped pretending otherwise. Cass and I talked about his mother Eliza and her axiom about what a man's worth was measured by, about the Cimarron country which he loved in the specific, complicated way a person loves a place that has also caused them great pain, about Red, his brother, the one who had actually done the raids, the one who was across the border and alive and free while Cass sat in a jail cell, and I noticed that Cass didn't speak about Red with anger. He spoke about him with a kind of exhausted, long-carrying grief, the grief of someone who has spent many years watching someone they love make choices they can't stop, and has had to find a way to hold the love and the grief at the same time without either one destroying the other. He wasn't always like that, Cass said on the 4th day. When we were boys, Red was the one who, he used to bring home hurt animals. Birds, mostly. He had this whole system for splinting wings, little sticks and strips of cloth. He'd tend them for weeks. What happened? Cass was quiet for a long while. Slow accumulation, he said finally. Every injustice that doesn't get answered, every time a man gets pushed sideways and there's nobody to push back. Red started keeping a ledger of wrongs. He decided he was owed something. Once a man decides he's owed something, it changes the shape of everything he does. And you didn't decide that? I decided it once, Cass said. I was 19. I had a month's wages stolen from me by a cattle boss who knew I couldn't prove it, and I spent 3 days deciding what I was owed and planning how to collect it. What stopped you? He thought about this. Dust, he said. Not the horse, I didn't have dust yet. The feeling. That morning feeling when everything is still and gray and you can't quite see the color of things yet. I'd been sitting up all night planning, and I went outside just before dawn and there was this light, you know the light I mean, just before the sun, when everything is present but nothing is committed yet. I knew the light, and I thought this is the only moment there is, right here, and I could use it for the ledger or I could use it for something else. He paused. I rode out that morning and I found work on a spread 40 miles east and I started over. I never got the wages back. I never got even. Do you regret it? Every now and then, he said honestly, less than I would have regretted the other thing. I wrote all of it down. On the 5th day, Cook got a telegraph from Santa Fe. The district court was reviewing the record. The judge reviewing the record had questions about the statute compliance timeline. Judge Traber had been contacted and the word was responding, which told you very little about what he was actually saying, but meant he was being held accountable to someone for the first time in the process. It was not a writ, it was not a stay, but it was, as I told Holt, the shape of a paper trail. On the 6th day, Red Harlan came back across the border. I need to stop here and tell you that what Red Harlan did is the thing I've thought hardest about in the 4 years since, because it doesn't fit cleanly into any story I know how to tell about human beings. It sits at the edge of categories. He came into Redrock at noon with his hands up, not because anyone had a gun on him, but because he'd ridden in with his hands up from the edge of town, and everyone could see it. And when he got to the jail, he dismounted with his hands still up and said he was surrendering himself to Sheriff Holt. Holt, who had been having a complicated week, looked at Red Harlan for a long time before saying anything. Why, he said. Red was older than Cass by 4 years and looked older than that, harder, more worn at the edges, with the flat eyes of a man who has spent a long time not looking at anything he didn't want to see. He was the one who'd burned the Henderson line camps, the one who'd run off the 140 head. I could see all of it in the set of his jaw, the practiced negligence in his posture. And underneath all of it, in the particular quality of his stillness as he stood with his hands in the air. Something that looked, at close range, like a very old and carefully contained devastation. Because my brother almost hanged for what I did, Red said. Holt looked at him. That's all, Red said. That's the whole thing, bring me in. Holt brought him in. Cass didn't see his brother that day. Holt kept them in separate cells, which was practical and probably humane. But I was there when Cook told Cass, and I watched Cass's face move through about a dozen different emotions in about 10 seconds, shock, and then something that looked like anger, and then something that looked like grief, and then something I couldn't name that might have been gratitude and might have been anguish and might have been both of those pressed so tightly together they'd become indistinguishable. He didn't say anything. He sat very still. After a long time, he said, he came back. Yes, Cook said. He could have stayed across the border. Yes. Another long silence. Outside, through the high window, dust was moving, the slow, soft footfall of a horse pacing back and forth, back and forth. He came back, Cass said again, and he said it differently this time. Not incredulous. Something older than incredulousness. Something that had been kept in a very small room for a very long time and was now standing in a larger space and didn't quite know what to do with the extra dimensions. Cook gave me a look over Cass's head that said, give him a moment. I gave him a moment. Then I went to the window and stood there and listened to dust pacing, and I thought about Red with his hands up and his flat eyes and that devastation underneath everything. And I thought about what Cass had said about the ledger of wrongs and what happens to a man who decides he's owed something. What happens, I thought, when the ledger comes due in a currency you didn't expect? What happens when you find out that the price of everything you took is not what they charge you, but what it costs the person who never took anything? I opened my logbook. I wrote Red Harlan came back, hands up on his own. Then I wrote, some things don't fit in a ledger. The review from Santa Fe came on the 7th day, which in another kind of story would be significant. It was, legally, exactly what Cook had argued it would be. The minimum statutory period had been improperly calculated from sentencing rather than from arrest, and the execution had been scheduled within a window that did not satisfy the territorial requirement for available legal representation. On those grounds alone, The sentence was set aside pending a new trial with full procedural compliance. Judge Traber, when reached by telegraph, apparently had several things to say about this. I don't know what they were. Nobody told me and I didn't ask. Some things are better left unrecorded. Cass received the news in the cell, the same way he'd received everything. Sitting against the wall, the internal arithmetic running, the measured calm that was not indifference but the habitual discipline of a man who'd learned that hope was expensive and wasn't going to spend what he hadn't saved. When Cook finished explaining, Cass sat for a long moment. Then he asked, "What happens now?" "New trial," Cook said, "with proper process, with Red's surrender and his testimony and with the documentary record." He glanced at me. "With the full record, the evidentiary case against you is substantially weakened. You weren't at the raids. The witnesses against you were identifying Harlan's generally, not you specifically. With Red in custody, there's someone to attach the specific charges to." "And Red?" Cook was quiet for a moment. "Red faces the charges that are actually his," he said. "That's the honest answer." Cass nodded slowly. "That's right," he said. "That's how it should be." He didn't say it with satisfaction. He said it with something heavier than satisfaction. The recognition that justice, when it finally comes, doesn't feel the way you imagined. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a door opening onto a room that's been sealed for a long time, and the air inside is stale and real and complicated, and yours to live in now. "Can I see Dust?" he said. Holt brought him out under escort, technically not released but not restrained. A semantic grace note that I think Holt extended because Holt, underneath the long jaw and the patient skepticism, was a man who understood that some things mattered in ways that the law didn't have words for. They brought Cass out into the alley beside the jail. Dust heard him before he saw him. The ears went forward, then the whole head turned, and then the horse was moving, not dramatically, just the direct, purposeful movement of an animal going toward the one thing it needed to reach. He pushed his nose against Cass's chest and stood there, and Cass put both arms over the horse's neck and pressed his face into the horse's mane, and I looked away because some things are not for witnesses. I wrote in my logbook. I wrote down the date and the time and the light and the temperature, all the measurable things, because that was what I had. Then I stopped writing and just listened. The sound Cass made with his face in Dust's mane was not a sound I'm going to write down. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just the sound a person makes when they put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time, and the ground holds them, and they remember that the ground was always going to hold them. Dust stood absolutely still and let himself be held. There is a particular quality of light in the New Mexico territory in late October that I have never been able to adequately describe and have been trying, in various logbook entries, for 20 years. It comes in the hour after sunrise, when the mountains to the east catch the light at an angle that makes them appear to be made of something other than stone, amber, rust, deep arterial red, the colors of a fire that's been burning for a very long time and has no intention of stopping. The shadows on the desert floor move differently in that light than they do at any other hour. Slower, with more weight, as though the land itself is paying attention to something. I noticed this on the morning I finally left Redrock, 31 days after I'd arrived on the 14th of October, 11 days after the Gallows, 8 days after Red Harlan's surrender, 3 days after the district court's review arrived and officially suspended the sentence and ordered the new trial scheduling. I had stayed far longer than any fence line dispute required. The fence line dispute had, in fact, been resolved on the 26th of October, an outcome favorable to neither party and satisfactory to both, which is the definition of a good survey. I'd extended my stay first on Cook's request, then on my own account, and then because I'd realized that I simply wasn't ready to leave yet, and the fence line dispute had given me enough of a pretext that I didn't have to examine that reason too closely. On the morning of the 15th of November, I examined it. I stood at my hotel window, the window that faced the jail, and the alley beside the jail where Dust stood in the dark, and I looked at the Gallows platform, which was still in the center of Main Street. Nobody had taken it down. Holt said they'd get to it. I suspected nobody quite knew what to do with it. You can't easily dismantle a thing that was interrupted, can't erase the shape of what almost happened on it. My logbooks were in my saddlebag. 42 of them, then 43, then half of 44. I'd bought 2 new logbooks from the general store, which the proprietor had mentioned with mild curiosity, since a surveyor requiring 3 logbooks in 30 days was the kind of detail that gets noticed in a small town. I went to the jail for the last time. They let me back to say goodbye. Not with Holt this time. Holt was dealing with the complicated paperwork of 2 Harlan brothers in custody on distinct charges, a new trial date to coordinate, and a Judge Traber who was being unpleasant about the review from 4 territories away. Deputy Crandall, a young man with an honest face and the nervous habit of clearing his throat before speaking, let me through. Cass looked better. Not well, not the way a man looks well when everything is resolved and he's sleeping peacefully, but better in the way a man looks when the worst thing has happened and he's still standing, when the future is uncertain but present, when there is something ahead even if its shape isn't clear yet. He was sitting on the floor of the cell with his back against the cot and his knees up, which was a new position for him, and he was doing something with his hands that I couldn't immediately identify, a careful, repetitive motion, one hand over the other. As I got closer, I saw he was braiding something. 3 strips of what looked like torn shirt cloth worked into a simple but neat braid. "What's that for?" I said. "Dust's mane," he said. "It's gotten tangled, something to do while I wait." He kept braiding. His hands were steady, which seemed remarkable to me given everything. "Cook thinks the new trial date will be January," he said. Apparently they need time to properly compile the testimony from the Henderson spread witnesses and Red's deposition, and he stopped braiding for a moment. And Red's lawyer needs time to work through the charges. He got himself a lawyer. "Good," I said. "Yes," Cass said, "good." He said it carefully, like a man testing a step to see if it holds. We were quiet for a moment. The high window let in the late October light in a narrow shaft that crossed the cell floor between us, and in it I could see the tiny motes of dust that are always present in old buildings, spinning, rising, falling, indifferent. "I've been thinking about what you said," Cass said, "about writing things down so they don't disappear." "What about it?" "I think you're right. But I think there's a second part that you didn't say." I waited. "You write things down so they don't disappear," he said. "But then you have to be willing to use what you wrote, to bring it into the room, to hold it up where people can see it." He looked at me. "You did that. The telegraphs, the documentation, the statute. You didn't just write it down, you brought it in." I didn't have a ready answer for this. "I'm not much for," I started. "I know," he said. "You're a surveyor, you measure things." A small pause. "That's not nothing, Thomas. Knowing where the lines are is not nothing." I looked at him. He looked at me with those dark hazel eyes that red, brown, or green depending on the light, and right now they were somewhere between both. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Ask." "Dust on the gallows, what do you think?" I stopped, started again. "Do you know why he did it?" Cass looked at the braid in his hands. He worked 3 more passes through it, slow and careful. "No," he said. "I don't know why. I know he did it, and I know what it was. I know it wasn't instinct, and it wasn't accident. But why, in the sense you mean, I can't tell you." He paused. "I've been trying to figure out if it matters." "Does it?" "I think it doesn't," he said. "I think the why of it is between Dust and whatever part of the world he's answering to. The what of it is mine to carry." He tied off the end of the braid with a knot, looked at it. "He came up those stairs for me, that's what I know. The rest is above my understanding." I sat down on the floor across from him, which I don't think I'd done before. I'd always been standing, always been in the position of the visitor, the observer, the one who came and went. I sat down and put my logbook on my knee and held my pen. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. "You can ask." "What do you want when this is over, when the trial is done and whatever's on the other side of it?" He thought for a long time. The light moved in the high window, a cloud passing, or the angle of the sun shifting. "I want to go back to the Cimarron country," he said. "Not to where Red was, north of there. There's a valley up near Cimarron Canyon that I rode through once, maybe 15 years ago. I was just passing through and I didn't stop, because I was 22 and I was on my way to somewhere and I thought I'd go back." He paused. "I never went back." "You'll go back," I said. "Maybe," he said, with that careful hope management that was. I'd come to understand, not pessimism, but a kind of respect for the distance between wanting something and having it. "Maybe," I agreed, "because the distance is real. and pretending it isn't doesn't honor either the wanting or the having. I said goodbye to Cook, who was drowning in paperwork, and gave me a harried handshake and the genuine warmth of a man who'd found unexpected allies in unexpected places. I said goodbye to Holt, who shook my hand with two hands and said nothing in particular, which was, I'd learned, his way of saying something significant. And then I went to the alley beside the jail to say goodbye to Dust. He was standing in his usual position at the corner of the alley, and he watched me approach with his ears forward and his large, dark eyes steady. I stopped about 3 feet from him, close enough to be considered near, far enough to be respectful, and I looked at him. He looked at me. "You did something," I told him. "I don't know what to call it, but it's in the logbook." He blinked slowly, shifted his weight from one foreleg to the other. "Take care of him," I said. "He's going to have a hard few months." I know this is a ridiculous thing to say to a horse. I'm aware. I said it anyway, and Dust received it with the gravity of an animal that understands more than you think, which is either actually true or the most comforting fiction available, and I've long since stopped needing to know which. I put out my hand. Dust pressed his nose against my palm, warm and dry, a deliberate contact that lasted about 3 seconds. Then he turned back to face the jail. I walked to the livery stable, saddled my horse, and rode east out of Redrock as the morning light was beginning to move the shadows across the desert floor. The new trial happened in January of 1888, as Cook had estimated. I wasn't there. I was in Albuquerque by then, back to the ordinary business of fence lines and land disputes, and I heard about it 3 weeks after it concluded, in a letter from Cook written in his careful, slightly cramped hand. The letter was 2 pages. I'll give you the substance of it without the procedural details, since you've earned that. The charges against Cassidy Harlan were formally dismissed on the basis of insufficient evidence, attaching him specifically to the Henderson raids. The testimony of the Henderson witnesses, when examined under proper cross-examination, proved to be identification of the Harlan brothers collectively, not of Cass individually, and without specific evidence placing him at the raids, which didn't exist, because he hadn't been there. The prosecution had nowhere to stand. Red Harlan was convicted of cattle theft and destruction of property. He was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. Cook's letter said Red had received the sentence without protest, and that, at the moment of sentencing, he had looked at his brother across the courtroom in a way that Cook described as difficult to characterize, and left it there. I appreciated that he left it there. Some things don't need characterizing. Cass was released from jail on the 18th of January, 1888, 96 days after he'd first been brought in. Cook wrote that he walked out of the jail in the same clothes he'd been wearing when they arrested him, which had been washed at some point, but were still the universal brown of a man who works outdoors, and that the first thing he did was walk around to the alley beside the jail. Dust was still there. Cook wrote that he didn't know how long the horse had been standing in that alley, since the town had apparently stopped tracking it at some point, the way towns stop tracking things that have become fixtures. The alley had a water trough and a hitching rail, and the grain merchant on 2nd Street had apparently been sending feed down periodically. Cook was not clear on who had arranged this, and when I read that part of the letter, I felt something warm and private that I decided to keep to myself. Cass put his forehead against Dust's forehead. Cook wrote this like it was a small detail. It wasn't a small detail. Then Cass asked Cook for his saddlebag, which Cook had been keeping, and he took out a braid made of 3 strips of shirt cloth and worked it carefully into Dust's mane. And Cook wrote that Dust stood absolutely still while he did it, which anybody who'd spent any time around that horse would have expected. Then Cass Harlan mounted his grulla horse and rode north out of Redrock. I went to the Cimarron country the following spring. Not to look for Cass. That wasn't the intention. Or if it was a small part of a larger intention that had more to do with the fact that I'd been thinking about a valley north of Cimarron Canyon for 4 months, and I had a gap between survey commissions, and I was, at 51, developing the habit of going to see the things I'd been meaning to see before I convinced myself I'd get to them later. It's a different kind of country up there than the Redrock Plateau. The rock goes from red to gray to something close to silver in the higher elevations, and the canyon cuts deep enough that from certain angles it looks like a wound that never quite healed. Not scarred over, just open, permanent. The landscape's acknowledgement that not everything knits clean. The cottonwoods in the canyon bottom were still winter bare in late March, bone white against the dark rock. But the grass on the high meadows was already coming in, the thin, tentative green of a cold climate allowing itself one more chance. I found the valley Cass had described. I don't think this was an accident. It sits above the canyon in a natural bowl between two ridgelines, maybe 300 acres of good grass with a spring-fed creek along the eastern edge, and a view south that goes 30 miles on a clear day. The kind of place that stays with you because it's the right size for a human being, not overwhelming, not cramped, just scaled correctly to the dimensions of a life. There was a cabin. New construction, maybe 3 months old, raw timber, the notches still pale where the bark had been stripped, the chinking still winter white. A corral of young fence posts with good solid rails. A small outbuilding that was either a smokehouse or a start on a barn. And in the corral, a grulla horse. I sat on the ridge for a while and looked at all of this. I didn't go down. It wasn't an evasion. I'd have gone down if the cabin had been empty, gone closer to examine the construction, written down the details in my logbook. But the cabin wasn't empty, and going down felt like a thing that needed to be approached carefully, because some things need to be looked at from a distance first. After a while, the cabin door opened, and a man came out with a bucket in each hand, moving toward the corral. He saw me on the ridge. He stopped, set the buckets down, shaded his eyes with one hand. Then he raised the other hand once, palm out, the gesture people make when they mean, "I see you." I raised my hand back, the same gesture. We held it for a moment, two men on a clear March morning with 30 miles of air between the ridge and the horizon, making the oldest signal there is. "I see you. You're there." Then he picked up his buckets and walked to the corral. I sat on the ridge until I'd written everything down that I wanted to write down: the valley, the cabin, the color of the grass, the quality of the light, the horse in the corral lifting his head to watch the man come with the water, the white star on the horse's forehead catching the morning sun. Then I turned my horse south and began the long ride back. I filled 11 more logbooks since October of 1887. 54 total now, on the shelf above my desk in Albuquerque, where my wife Alina has arranged them in order of date, smallest to largest, which is not quite the order they were written in, but is a more aesthetically pleasing arrangement, and I've learned to choose my battles. I go back to the valley north of Cimarron Canyon in my mind more often than I go back in person, though I've made the ride 3 times since that March morning. There was a woman there by the second visit, a strong-boned woman named Rosario from Taos, who shook my hand like a carpenter and looked at me with eyes that suggested she'd heard about me, and not unfavorably. By the third visit there were 2 children, a girl 4 who had her father's dark hazel eyes and her mother's absolute disregard for diplomatic caution, and a boy 2 who had not yet developed strong opinions about anything except horses, which he favored strongly. I asked Cass on that third visit whether he'd spoken to Red. Red had been released from Santa Fe the previous spring, early, for good conduct, which surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. People are not fixed. "We wrote," Cass said. "We were sitting on the porch of the cabin in the early evening, with the valley going gold around us and the sound of the children somewhere around the corner of the corral. Not much, a little." "Is that enough?" He thought about it. "It's what there is," he said. "The rest is, I don't know yet. Some things take longer than you think they should." I thought about the ledger Red had kept, the ledger that had grown so heavy it had almost crushed Cass under its weight. And then I thought about Red coming back across the border with his hands up, not because anyone made him, not because he had no other choice, but because the ledger had finally shown him the cost of what he carried. "Your mother's axiom," I said, "about what a man's worth is measured by." Cass nodded. "Do you think Red is working toward it now?" A long pause. The gold in the valley deepened. "I think he's starting the count," Cass said. "I want to tell you about the last thing I wrote in logbook 44, on the morning I left Redrock. It was early, before sunrise, before the amber light hit the mountains. I was sitting at my window, saddlebag packed, ready to go, and I opened the logbook one more time because there was something I'd been trying to write for 11 days and hadn't gotten right. What I finally wrote was this: "The territory has a way of sorting men, Not fairly, never fairly, but eventually. It loses things and finds things and misplaces things in the wrong order, and sometimes the calibration is off by so many degrees that the error becomes visible even to the people administering it. That's when you learn what people are actually made of, not the ones being measured, the ones doing the measuring. Cass Harlan spent 96 days in a jail cell for something his brother did. A horse climbed a gallows. A governor's office used the word interested. An attorney rode 4 days to get there too late and showed up anyway. A sheriff kept his hand on his gun and didn't draw it. I sent telegraphs. It seemed like the smallest possible thing a person could do, and maybe it was, but small things accumulate. The record of a thing is part of the thing. Where the line is drawn is part of who does the drawing. I don't know what Dust knew, or how he knew it, or what moved in him when he heard those gallows steps being built in the dark. I don't know what it costs a horse to climb stairs it was never built to climb. Toward a platform it has no framework for understanding. For a man it has known for 6 years, and for whom it has, apparently, made its own calculations about worth. I know that I watched it happen, and that I wrote it down. I know that writing it down is not enough, but it's the beginning of enough. It's the place you start from. Dust died in the autumn of 1893, 16 years old, which is a full life for a horse that had worked as hard as he had. Cass wrote to me about it in a letter that I've kept between the pages of Logbook 49, where it still is today, pressed flat by the weight of what's on either side of it. The letter is 4 paragraphs. The first 3 are about practical matters: the ranch, the children, the water rights dispute that had come up with the neighbor to the north, which I noted with some professional interest. The 4th paragraph is about Dust. I'm not going to reproduce it here. It belongs to Cass. What I'll tell you is that the last sentence of the letter, after the 4th paragraph, after what he said about Dust, is this: I buried him on the ridge where you used to sit. I read that sentence the morning the letter arrived, and I set the letter down, and I sat very still for a while in my office in Albuquerque. Then I took out Logbook 54 and I wrote, Dust, 1871, 1893. Grulla, white star on forehead, scar on left shoulder lighter than the surrounding coat. I wrote down everything I could remember about the way he moved, the way he watched, the way he stood in the dark outside a jail with his head up and his attention undivided. Then I stopped writing, because there are things that go past the capacity of documentation. Some things you can measure, some things you can record. Some things you just have to carry,